From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden delivers a blustery and remarkably political State of the Union address as he tries to frame up the 2024 election and his rematch with Donald Trump. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. It seemed to my eye that the State of the Union address President Biden delivered last night before a joint session of Congress didn't have a whole lot of new policy, some emphasis on proposals that President Biden has made in the past, but it seemed to be mostly focused on the politics without a whole lot of bipartisanship or even attempt at bipartisanship. Let's start with a clip that I think characterizes a lot of the speech. This is President Biden talking about his infrastructure bill that he passed.
Thanks to our bipartisan infrastructure law, 46,000 new projects have been announced all across your communities. And by the way, I noticed some of you strongly voted against it, or they're cheering on that money coming in. I like it. I'm with you. I'm with you. And if any of you don't want that money in your district, just let me know.
Kim, I'll give you the floor, but what did you make of the president's remarks last night?
Well, on this show yesterday, I predicted that this would be a speech very much about blaming others for the problems that were going on. He did do that. What I didn't anticipate and was just stunned by was the hard partisan nature of it, how it was essentially one giant campaign rally. There was not even an attempt for this to be a statesman-like speech about the state of the union or outreach to the other side about joint projects that could get done. This was a president who demeaned the Supreme Court, who trashed on billionaires, who trashed on drug companies and corporations, who went after the NRA, who had some very sharp words for Israel, obviously in order to make good with some of his progressive partisans who haven't liked his support with Israel, and was very pointed and sharp toward Republicans. We can talk about the consequences of that, but it was really striking and something that everyone should remember the next time Democrats drone on about standards and norms and who and actually getting rid of them in this country. The other thing, obviously, was the performance. Everyone was watching, and I will say the president certainly had a lot of energy. I think the question, though, is did all those voters out there that are trying to be reassured by the president, were they so by basically an angry old guy yelling at them for 66 minutes? It was pretty vicious, and while, again, he got through without stumbles or gaffes, I'm not sure one performance like this necessarily makes up for the dozens upon dozens of other clips we have of him not nearly as with it.
Let's play that clip of President Biden speaking directly to those Supreme Court justices who attended right in front of him.
Look, it's a decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court majority wrote the following, and with all due respect, justices, women are not without electoral power. Electoral or political power. You're about to realize just how much you were right about that.
One thing that is fascinating there to me, Kate, is that he's departing from the prepared remarks as prepared for delivery on the White House website. Says women are not without electoral or political power. No kidding. And it was the ad lib of Joe Biden to make that statement directly to those justices. And it makes me wonder whether and how long those justices will continue to show up if that's what these State of the Union events are going to turn into. Justice Samuel Alito famously mouthed something during one of President Obama's speeches and has not been back in a long time. Kate, what other takeaways did you have from the speech overall?
Well, I agree with Kim that to the extent that the point of the speech was for Biden to show that he can stay up past 10 o'clock and be really animated about stuff, it's a testament to that he's starting out from a point of weakness. What really struck me about the speech was really the opening where he talked about Ukraine. And I'd note that the president was right that we have a lot at stake in Ukraine, but I think the net effect of what he did is going to make it harder to pass a Ukraine aid bill through the House. He basically compared Vladimir Putin rolling tanks into a neighboring country and lobbing cruise missiles at apartments and infrastructure with January 6th and acted as those were equivalent threats to democracy. In addition to being a ludicrous comparison, it's completely toxic with Republican voters. And so you have this situation where Mike Johnson is sitting behind him, and Mike Johnson, I think, has shown that he understands what's going on in Ukraine and why it's important that the U.S. help them. At the State of the Union last night, his guests were the parents of Evan Gershkovich, our journal reporter who's wrongfully detained in Russia. So I think Speaker Johnson understands the nature of the threat from Putin and why what's going on in Ukraine is important. But he has a 2-vote majority in the House, and half of the Republican conference is turning against Ukraine support, and it's become a toxic issue among the base. So I cannot understand the logic in basically alienating the folks whose votes you need to pass the Ukraine bill when Ukraine is one of the president's signature foreign policy priorities. So I'm very concerned that the net effect of this speech was to make Ukraine aid harder to pass. One other quick thing I would note is there was just a profound gap between the rhetoric and the substance in so many places, and nowhere more when the president was talking about the threats that the world faces. He started his speech by comparing the moment to Franklin Roosevelt in 1941. Okay, that's a pretty bracing comparison. Are we 12 months from Pearl Harbor? But then, of course, he spent no time elaborating on this axis of threats and their ideological nature and why they threaten the United States, on China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, the ways in which they're working together. And he proposed no new spending or investments in national defense whatsoever, something that even Jimmy Carter, in the end of his term, started to do against the Soviet Union. So I think those were 2 real missed opportunities in the speech that deserve more attention than they're getting.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Kim, a moment ago, you mentioned Biden's age. To my eye, that is perhaps his biggest political weakness. Again, he's 81. He often, I think, shows that he's 81, and he's asking voters to keep him in office until he turns 86 years old. And he addressed that concern, I think, not only in the forceful way that he was trying to deliver the speech, but also he brought it up as a point in the speech. Let's listen to that.
My fellow Americans, the issue facing our nation isn't how old we are. It's how old are our ideas. Hate, anger, revenge, retribution are the oldest of ideas. But you can't lead America with ancient ideas. It'll only take us back. You lead America, the land of possibilities. You need a vision for the future and what can and should be done.
So leave aside what I think is that strange kind of framing. Is hatred an older idea than love? Is sadness an older idea than happiness? I guess we'll leave that to the philosophers. But Kim, I'm wondering how many people he convinced. On the one hand, there's news out today that says Joe Biden's campaign is saying the 9 p.m. hour when Biden was revving up his State of the Union speech was the best fundraising hour of his election launch since last April. And that, I think, is notable. I think it may have reassured some Democrats. It was also interesting to watch Joe Biden stick around after the speech and mingle and backslap with members of the Senate, members of the House of Representatives. And that seems where he is often most at home, joking around with them, chatting with them. The commentary on C-SPAN host said, for the first time in memory, the president outlasted the House session. They turned down the lights, and President Biden took over half an hour to work his way off the House floor. And one of those moments that C-SPAN captured was a Democratic congressman coming up to Biden and saying, nobody's going to talk about cognitive impairment now. And then Biden joked back, sometimes I wish I was cognitively impaired, seriously. So showing a little bit of humor there. But Kim, it may be a situation where he has convinced enough Democrats, and particularly enough Democratic elites and office holders and power brokers, that he still has it, that he can run through the tape this November, while still yet not quite convincing those independents and those swing voters who are really worried about this age issue and who are not in the chamber on Thursday night, being able to talk to Joe Biden after his speech and see him one-on-one.
I don't know if I'd use the word convinced Democrats. I think what he did last night is reassure them that if he has 4 or 5 days to practice intensely for his speech and is on all the right medications, he can have a good night. This was a decision, by the way, too, that the speechwriters very clearly made in this speech for him to address age straight up and head on. And so you gave the example of him talking about age and ideas, and that was a very odd framing frightening to me as well, too. The one that stuck out to me a little bit more was he said a couple of times, when you're my age, and then went on to suggest that with that age came great wisdom. And it was very much this attempt to present Joe and his age as an asset to the country. Here is Papa Joe. He's got many years under the belt. He's seen it all, and he can handle any crisis that comes along and take care of it, versus these whippersnappers that are merely in their 50s or their 60s. So that was the clear intention. I don't necessarily buy it. Look, I hope Democrats felt good about it, and clearly he can bring it on if he needs to. But as we have seen from episode after episode, this is a president who is struggling a bit. And he's now going to go back out on the campaign trail. He isn't going to have all that time to practice like he did for this State of the Union. There's going to be more clips of him having a bit of difficulty. And I don't think it's the leading problem for most voters, but it's just one of those things that hangs on them as they go to the polls and they feel uneasy. It was a great try. I don't see any way for the White House to actually turn that narrative around.
Well, let's turn to what I think is maybe the second biggest vulnerability politically for President Biden, and that's the border. And he addressed that in an interesting section of the speech where he was kind of reaching out to Republicans, but kind of not. Let's listen to that.
In November, my team began serious negotiation with a bipartisan group of senators. The result was a bipartisan bill with the toughest set of border security reforms we've ever seen. Oh, you don't think so? Oh, you don't like that bill, huh? That conservatives got together and said it was a good bill? I'll be darned. That's amazing. That bipartisan bill would hire 1,500 more security agents and officers, 100 more immigration judges to help tackle the backload of 2 million cases, 4,300 more asylum officers, and new policies so they can resolve cases in 6 months instead of 6 years now. What are you against?
Okay, part of what I thought was fascinating was in that bit where President Biden is saying that it would hire more asylum officers and so forth. At least the feed that I was watching, the camera turned to Republican Senator from Oklahoma, James Lankford, who was mouthing something like, that's true, and nodding his head a little bit. And so a couple things are interesting about this. One is that, as we've discussed on this program, I think there's merit to many of these provisions in that Lankford bill. But that seems like it's not going to pass at this point. And President Biden seems like he's trying to frame the border issue as, I'm ready to do something. It's these Republicans who are not. And I just don't think that is going to work, given the chaos that people are seeing at the border, given President Biden's previous statements, his previous actions, rescinding the Remain in Mexico policy and so forth. And I'm surprised, frankly, that he did not have a better answer for that. There had been some rumors about executive orders that the White House was thinking about, and this, to my mind, would have been a place to roll that out. And even if he's not going to get this bipartisan bill that he thinks is a worthy bill to help solve the situation at the border, bring something to the country and say, I'm taking some sort of action. Otherwise, I think he's in real trouble in November.
I agree, though. I think it's a political risk for both him and Republicans. And the pity is that the failure of this deal has made it so that Biden can hide behind that deal's failure and simply say, well, like you said, I want to do something, but Republicans are rejecting the bill that they helped come up with. And the real reason that bill, like we were talking about the merits of it weeks ago, is worth passing is because it's not for the reasons he mentioned, but because it would reform the underlying asylum incentives that are allowing so many people to just pour into the country and claim asylum, disappear into the interior for years and years. But I do think he is, to your point, accepting a big political risk by simply not doing anything else, because voters know that Biden didn't do anything about it for years in advance, even ahead of those border negotiations. And they also know that his interest in it happens to coincide with it overtaking even a bad economy in the polls as the number one voting issue. But I think that risk is a risk for Republicans too. So it's socialized among both Biden and Republicans on who voters will blame more for the manifest failures to do anything in Washington about the border.